And we are live. Alrighty. Excellent. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Culkin's Trilogy, also known in various locations online as Byron of Sidious. And today's solo presentation here in the corner will be a review of Clive Barker's 1989 masterwork of dark fantasy or fantastical horror, depending on your perspective or slant, The Great and Secret Show, Book 1 of The Art. Now, something that I should point out that many folks in literary circles online have pointed out is that to date, here now, in January of 2025, we still do not have a third and final entry into this planned trilogy, though Mr. Barker is still with us and has been working diligently on the Arabat novels, which I have yet to start, but I think I'm going to get started on those soon, because he is currently in the process of writing up the last novel in that ongoing series. And if he intends to write the third and final act of the Art series, he will probably begin once he finishes Arabat. Now, I have not yet read the second book in this planned trilogy. I only recently, about 5 days ago, closer to 7 days ago, finished reading The Great and Secret Show, and then putting together over the course of the last 6 days my review and some supplemental written material regarding this novel. Now, something that I have seen several other streamers and video content producers who I enjoy doing is they will begin their stream or their broadcast on multiple avenues. And then when they get to a certain point, they will click away or remove themselves from streaming simultaneously on several pathways and then narrow themselves down to one or two. And I'm actually going to try doing that today myself. Right now, if you are viewing this review live, it is available currently on both YouTube and on Rumble. You'll probably notice there's an icon for the Rumble Studio because Rumble is the primary methodology through which I do my personal streams. When I complete the presentation of the primary review presentation, I will be disconnecting from YouTube. And the supplemental material that I've got jotted down in here will be only for Rumble viewers. So if you are interested in getting the entirety of this particular weirdo's thoughts on Clive Barker's wonderfully, fantastically grim The Great and Secret Show, then I would recommend that you watch it on Rumble. If all you want is the primary review itself, then you can catch that on either platform, be it YouTube or Rumble. But if you want more detail and a little bit more nuance, head on over to Rumble. And I know the folks at YouTube aren't going to like the fact that I'm already recommending a competitor within the first 5 to 10 minutes of this stream. But quite frankly, Neil Mohan and his censorious group of underlings at Google/YouTube/Alphabet, whatever you want to call them, if they don't care for it, perhaps they could do the hard work of not being a bunch of censorious pricks and motivating people like myself to want to go elsewhere. So, with all of that aside, and I recognize that folks right now have a lot more real world concerns and real world events and ongoing crises to contend with. And I wish in a way that I was better equipped to cover such events and incidents. But I'm a storyteller, I'm a clown, I'm a presenter of the fantastical, the weird, and the grim. So I'm sticking to what I know and what I know I can do well. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to now proceed into the reading of my review for Clive Barker's 1989 novel, The Great and Secret Show. To begin with, it should be noted that my prior experiences with the works of Clive Barker include reading his first two books of blood, short story collections, The Thief of Always, The Hellbound Heart, Weave World, and Cabal, which was later adapted into film as Nightbreed. I'm also familiar with the plot treatments that he crafted for the video games Clive Barker's The Undying on PC and Clive Barker's Jericho, which was unfortunately a convoluted mess. Don't blame the original author, however. He did amazing both the plot treatment as well as the concept art for the vast majority of the creatures that you would fight against in both of those games. He was also rumored to have a hand in contributing to the concept art for the creature monsters in Midway's The Suffering, as well as the sequel, Suffering, The Ties That Bind. But again, this is rumored and has never been confirmed by Barker himself. I'm read in on much of this man's work, but I am not what one might consider an expert on his crestomathy. And if you're not familiar with that term, a crestomathy is a kind of an overall compilation or summary of an entire person's works. I decided to finally look into The Great and Secret Show when, after reading and reviewing Weave World, an online colleague indicated that since I had mostly enjoyed that tale, I might take a shine to Barker's art trilogy, which begins with The Great and Secret Show. As I pen this introduction, I have about 100 pages left to read in it, and though I would love to launch right this second into a lengthy diatribe about some of the core elements, mechanics, and characters of this work, I will for now hold back until I am finished with the book. Why? Because whatever else Barker's The Great and Secret Show is, it is also deeply compelling. Asterisk. One day later, and I have blitzed through the last of the book, which I will confess did put a lot of prior material in the story into a new light. A well-written, expertly crafted mythos can do that, though, despite a few minor blemishes here and there. Dark and Secret Show is, quite frankly, among the greatest dark fantasy or fantastical horror stories that I have ever personally read. Because of that, this is one of those rare reads that I'll be both reviewing here and expanding upon with a few supplemental analytical treatises, which, again, I'll be sharing exclusively on Rumble. Synopsis. In Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show, Randolph Jaffe, a middle-aged nobody assigned to the Dead Letters Office in Omaha, Nebraska in 1969, stumbles upon a series of codes and secrets, occult truths, scribbled by mad people from all around the country. These writings become his obsession, along with something dubbed the art. Driven mad himself, Jaffe sets out after the abrupt murder of his boss on a journey of studying various occult pathways and schools of power, ever in search of this obscure power, the art. Eventually, Jaffe concludes that his approach, so primal and magical in nature, needs balance, and he seeks out and recruits to his cause a scientific researcher and experimenter named Fletcher, whose own bizarre and unorthodox methodologies and searches seem to be aimed at a similar goal: uncovering the true nature of reality, the art. Blending magic and science, this pair creates magnificent metamaterial which they dub the Nuncio, a kind of alchemical compound which forces the living sentience that it touches to undergo a queer form of psychic and biological evolution, elevating them up the ladder of capability and form. In a scuffle over this compound, the two men each are touched, transformed, and immediately set to war with one another. For the Jaffe desires the art to breach quiddity, a kind of heaven-like plane of existence known also as the Dream Sea, and Fletcher wishes only to preserve quiddity and keep it pure from such corruptions as the Jaffe. Their conflict tears and rages across the country, disrupting nature around them itself in ways that are bizarre and inexplicable to most people. Drained and finding themselves at a stalemate, these evolved beings crash in a locked impasse into a woodland valley in an existential clutch at each other's throats, locked in a stalemate near the budding township area of Palamo Grove, California. Recognizing that they require champion proxies to carry on their war, the men, now dubbed nunciates, reach out to four adolescent girls with their otherworldly wills, compelling them to go forth and try to become pregnant. One fails and is driven completely mad. One succeeds, but in a fit of dread kills themselves and their offspring. A third catches pregnant, and her family flees in shame to Chicago, where she gives birth to a single boy. And the fourth, a girl raised as a devout Mormon, she has twins, whom she names Tommy Ray and Joe Beth. We'll get to more details in the plot section of this review and future rambles about this book. Let's get into the sectional ratings, however, the highlights and the lowlights. Characters, 8.5 out of 10. As tends to happen with a work as lengthy as Barker's The Great and Secret Show, there end up being a veritable plethora of characters to keep track of by the time that all is said and done. A less skilled storyteller than Barker would likely struggle to keep them all properly placed, developed, and portrayed. But like the talented wordslinger that he is, Barker's cast for show ends up being superbly put together for the most part and implemented throughout. The primary protagonists and antagonists of the tale aren't all perfect, mind you, but they are soundly utilized and explored, and only lapse out of a full 3D development into archetype territory in a couple of instances. The most notable of these downturned shortcomings stems from the character of Tommy Ray, whose less than stellar moments still outshine plenty of examples of characters in modern dark fantasy, even though he turns out to be sort of a classical edgelord sort of character. The secondary or supporting cast, by dint of being smaller in number and bordering between archetype and stereotype, ends up bringing the character score down a little bit from a solid 9 to an 8.5 by my estimation. Plot, 9 out of 10. To say that the overarching plot of The Great and Secret Show is convoluted or daunting in scale and scope is to downplay the fact of the matter. Barker touches upon universal themes of love, conflict, miracles, multidimensionalism, the occult, magical realism, evolution, death, sex, a lot of that, fear, and philosophy or religion in ways that beggar me to consider trying to cram all of them into a single novel. But he pulls it off with style and without being too far up his own ass about it to be enjoyable. Frankly, the narrative is enjoyable, despite its occasional meandering. I did end up docking him a point here, though, for sometimes drifting somewhat needlessly from the macro to the micro with a whiplash speed a few times. World building mechanics, 9.5 out of 10. There are almost no concepts or conceits introduced by Barker whilst building the lore of the Great and Secret Show that don't end up having some spectacular payoffs. And the ones that are more ephemeral or mysterious are kept ephemeral and mysterious, rather than having some half-assed, half-baked, tacked-on justification jammed on, like a homemade sidecar onto the side of a factory-built motorcycle. From the dualities lovingly implemented and guided to balance the plot and characters, to the soft magic system that clearly pays homage to the Lovecraftian in technique and tone, Clive Barker threads classic fantasy tropes with facets of horror in a way that only someone as equally blessed as perhaps Peter Straub could manage. The only low point for me about Show's world building stems from an over-reliance on some shock factor in a few scenes, and the creatures known as the Licks. That whole thing will get a deeper dive in our supplemental material piece later on the character of Kassoon, the creeptacular shaman of the loop. If you join me for that on Rumble, you'll hear exactly what I'm referring to. Back in a moment, folks. Just have to hit the loo. Give me one more. My apologies for the break in flow there, but a different kind of flow had to be tended to. Sorry. Moving along here. Narrative technique, 8 out of 10. Barker's style and narrative voice throughout The Great and Secret Show is solid and relies on thorough but wondrous detail that stays away from getting too purple prosy, which is one of the problems that I have with some fantasy storytellers, for its own good. Richly imaginative, provocative, and immersive, Barker excels at wrapping readers' minds into the world that he has fashioned between the covers of his work. Where he occasionally indulges in the flowery or the poetic, Barker doesn't linger overlong, which is welcome in a story as borderline psychedelic as The Great and Secret Show gets in a few spots. The only downturn in technique here, for me, stems really from Barker's over-reliance on stacking conflicts and climaxes one atop the other, and his over-reliance on hypersexualized passages. Whilst checking out a review from YouTuber Too Many Books, I recommend giving his channel a check out, I chuckled at his observation that Barker's Great and Secret Show was, quote, just way too horny in some spots and without good cause. This is rather aptly put, and strikes me as a hang-on artifact of Barker's lineage as a horror storyteller. Horror, as I have touched upon in another separate article piece that I did over on my Substack some time back, horror has a tendency to really focus on the sex and death dynamic, particularly in lycanthrope fiction or vampire fiction. It only gets deeply distasteful for my personal tastes, in two spots, but those are notable enough that I momentarily considered dropping this area of the review to a 7. However, even when Barker overdoes it, he is consistent in his excess, and that deserves a tip of the hat and a recognition of his ability as a storyteller. Pacing. 4 out of 10. And this is the big hit. This is the biggest issue for me when I was reading it. The almost negligible blemishes in plot and technique, and the shortcomings in a couple of characters within the Great and Secret Show are, to put it simply, nothing compared to the most glaring flaw in what is hands down otherwise one of the best examples of genre fiction that I have engaged with in recent memory, and that is this book's pacing. Barker's The Great and Secret Show operates at a rhythm that could be aptly described as crawl, sprint, crawl, walk, stumble, sprint, fall on its face, walk, crawl, sprint. A herky-jerky that leaves one disoriented for several paragraphs or pages, and then in a couple of scenes, there's events unfolding so rapidly that you almost have to go back and retrack and reread them in order to capture their import, since Barker has already moved on to yet another conflict climax follow-up sequence. It's only when the story gets smutty that Barker seems to want to really linger, or when he gets slightly overindulgent when Tesla Bombeck considers the quiddity, the great dream sea, in philosophical musing moments. And regarding the last 75 to 100 pages of the book, so much vital action and character growth and development and change is crammed into this last stretch that it almost feels like Barker forgot for a moment that he had an entire other book to write, and instead of opting to do that, he's decided to compress that entire second novel's worth of material into the last 1/5 of The Great and Secret Show. Given how gorgeous this book is, the pacing problem feels like a bit of a crime against it. Conclusions. Over the course of his career, Clive Barker has ensorcelled audiences with his mastery of the narrative crafts in a way that few can match. And his The Great and Secret Show is without a doubt one of the richest mythos that he or any contemporary in dark fantasy or fantastical horror has penned in the last half century, and I am confident in claiming that. Its brilliance easily compensates for the weaknesses that it hosts, and despite its clear setup at the end for a furtherance of the overall tale, it concludes in such a poetic fashion that one could easily walk away feeling that no more needs to be said, that the reader's imagined continuations or confabulations could readily satisfy if this were an open-ended standalone novel. The fact that Everville is out there already, though no third book of the art has yet been published, is almost rendered needless if one wanted to step away from this series. And that takes deep talent. And also, like the greatest works of literary and genre fiction, The Great and Secret Show lends itself to deeper reflection, contemplation, and analysis post-reading. I'll offer some of those analyses after this review for those who are interested in sticking around on Rumble. Whether you're a fan of fantasy and horror, or if you're not, I would still offer a deeply heartfelt recommendation that you give Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show your time, attention, and effort. True, you may not end up as enamored with it as I was. A brief look at other takeaways online makes that clear, especially among Redditors who, frankly, are on the whole about as literarily discerning as a coke-fed shark in an aquarium filled with chum. But I digress. Sorry. If you are a fan of dark fantasy or fantastical horror, however, then I would mark The Great and Secret Show, despite its pacing problems, as required reading. Mathematically, no. This book doesn't score a perfect 10. Mathematically, it actually ends up getting battered down to a 7.8 due to the pacing problem. But as I implied before, everything beautiful about this work makes my personal qualms about its pacing pale in comparison to the significance of the wonderment that is The Great and Secret Show. So I would recommend that you go out and get a copy of this book, whether it be digital or physical, as soon as possible. And that does it for the main bulk of the review of Barker's The Great and Secret Show. There is occasionally going to come across your path, if you are a bibliophile, a piece of fiction that, despite some of its flaws or errors, despite some of the reputation of the storyteller themselves, will be so compelling that you, as a discerning reader, have no real choice but to confess, at least to yourself, this was really good. I would liken this to the phenomenon that has taken place over about the last 15 to 20 years of the constant insult and denigration heaped upon the head of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a deeply disturbed and a literally physically sick man. And what most people tend to focus on regarding Lovecraft is the fact that he was a belligerent racist and anti-Semite in his youth and throughout most of his adulthood. But what a lot of people are willing to completely ignore or cast aside is that as he was dealing with his impending demise in the last days of his life, he looked back and rejected the notions that he had put pen to previously. He recognized that he had been an overt racist and that he had no good reason to be as belligerent as he was towards other people. Lovecraft's technique and Lovecraft's methodology of creating weird fiction and cosmic horror provided for other future storytellers a framework of atmosphere and mechanics of world building that would allow storytellers like Peter Straub, like Clive Barker, like Stephen King, like the folks at From Software, if you look at Bloodborne, to couch and frame their narratives in such a way as to make them connect with us on a deeply primal level and to hook us in and keep us balanced in the weird in between of comfort and discomfort and confusion. That is the sort of mastery that is brought forward from Lovecraft's era to Barker's era, and that you can find on display between the covers of The Great and Secret Show. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the point where I am going to be disconnecting from the YouTube element of this stream. So if you are interested in hearing the supplemental materials that I jotted down, I would recommend, if you're on YouTube, that you hop off and get on over to Rumble, the Mean Green Machine, as Jeremy Hambley of the Quartering calls it. Though what he should be calling it is the place that he should focus more of his efforts if he's going to consistently and continually bitch and complain about YouTube suppressing him. You already know about Rumble and you utilize it. Get the fuck over there for the most part, Jeremy. Get off your ass and actually practice what you preach. So, for the folks who are on YouTube, I'd like to thank you for stopping in and for listening to this review. I hope that you'll take my recommendation and grab yourself a copy of this novel if you are a fellow bibliophile or a fan of fantasy and or horror. And I do hope that you take care of yourselves and are well. And I ask that you, as always, keep reading. Now we're going to try to see if we can disconnect. All right, currently streaming to Rumble and YouTube. Rumble only. Okay. And update. Okay. So hopefully that worked. We shall see. Not sure if that's going to hold consistently. Stream redirect. Rumble only. Update stream. Do I have to click it again? All right. We'll see if this worked. If it turns out that it didn't, then just understand I'm a putz and a Luddite, and I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. I apologize for that. But so I'm going to dive now into a handful of supplemental pieces that I wrote up over the last few days. I kind of give a little bit more deeper analysis and look into certain elements and aspects of Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show. The first one is The Nuncio, Clive Barker's Philosopher's Stone. Reading from handwritten review or notation. In the era before the establishment of our modern and recognized sciences, but well past the centuries in which the speculative and faith-based devotions to various schools of magic or religious creeds were turned to as the central avenues of the pursuit of truth, in the Middle Era, and with a certain amount of philosophical crossover, there came a study of the functions of nature which had one foot in the material and one in the spiritual. That study was alchemy. One of the best known details of this field of study, contemplation, and experimentation is something referred to as the Philosopher's Stone. The specific details surrounding what this artifact is, how it is made, and what precisely it is used for has been the subject of much narrative speculation and exploration in fiction for generations. A common tie between sorry, had a little bit of a hiccup there. A common tie between the various interpretations in media is this, however. Whatever exactly the Philosopher's Stone is, it is an object or material of immense power and potential, which can be used to achieve the seemingly impossible, miraculous, and or ridiculous. In Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show, the characters of Randolph Jaffe and Fletcher are two men who have inadvertently come to suspect that there's more to the fabric of reality than most people are aware of. They are both seeking answers from quite oppositional angles. Where Fletcher, a man steeped in obscure scientific theorem and experimentation, explores the subject of reality from a scientific and materialistic view, Randolph Jaffe follows a path stemming from the occult, the arcane, the philosophical, and the magical, towards that same subject, the nature of reality itself. When Jaffe seeks to look outside of his approach for a fresh take, it leads him almost in no time at all to laser focus in on, reach out to, and start working with Fletcher on the matter. Through combining their studies, knowledge, and efforts, the pair ultimately succeeds in a parallel to this ages-old pursuit, creating miraculous metamaterial, which Fletcher dubs the Nuncio. Within the confines of Barker's story, the Nuncio seems to be a quasi-sentient substance which, when it comes into contact with sentient organisms, unlocks and compels a form of psycho-spiritual and physical accelerated evolution. Whilst testing the metamaterial prior to informing Jaffe of his final success, Fletcher exposes a literal lab ape to the Nuncio. After this exposure, the ape in question, named Raoul, begins walking upright, learns basic English from Fletcher, and overall becomes more manlike. This, he holds, is proof that the Nuncio works as aimed. But Fletcher is filled with trepidation at the possible ramifications of this miraculous material falling into the wrong hands. Randolph Jaffe is exactly those wrong hands. As Fletcher sets about trying to destroy the very lab where he completed the Nuncio, Jaffe interrupts his sabotage. In their struggle, both men get dosed or splashed with the substance, and their oppositional natures are thus exaggerated and enhanced through the compelled evolution of the Nuncio, activating in these sentient creatures. Though this corollary is not a one-to-one comparison, it is undeniable for those familiar with the mythology of alchemy's philosopher's stone to see that it is nonetheless a great approximation. It is unknown to me at time of this writing if Barker intended this comparison in the context of the Great and Secret Show, though I would not be surprised if that were the case. Even as far back as 1989, when the book was published, the British author showed a flair for incorporating elements of the obscure into his fiction works. Oi. Just a moment. There is more supplemental material, just grabbing a quick smoke here. And as there are no current live chats, I figure I can take a moment, take a breather. Although I'm wondering. Okay. Nope. Nothing is yet. So moving on into the second supplemental piece. Fletcher, Jaffe, Tommy Ray, and Raoul, recipients of power well in over their heads. In my initial review of The Great and Secret Show, which you just listened to earlier, and the write-up section of thoughts preceding this one regarding the Nuncio, I explained in summary form that story's magnificent metamaterial, known as the Nuncio. What I did not do at that time was delve into the 5 characters in the story who were each touched and thus altered by the Nuncio, 4 of whom I'll be covering in this piece, and the 5th of whom will get her own exploration. Those 5 characters are Fletcher, Randolph Jaffe, Tommy Ray, Raoul, and Tesla Bombeck. Tesla will be addressed separately in her own piece. I must begin this separate piece by pointing out that my observations here aren't going to make a great deal of sense to anyone who hasn't read Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show, or at least skimmed a detailed synopsis treatment of this story. So my apologies if I seem to be going off into a direction that makes no sense. In chronological order of exposure, Raoul the ape was the first being to be touched and evolved by the Nuncio as a kind of guinea pig, his mind and body undergoing a process that might sound familiar to Fallout fans, a forced evolutionary adaptation, kind of like the FEV, the forced evolutionary virus, but, without ghouls or super mutants. Fletcher, Jaffe's scientist partner in researching the art, quiddity, and all of that is associated, tested this metamaterial on the lower primate, pushing Raoul to become a kind of artificially accelerated missing link between ape and human. Just imagine being that poor schmuck. In the aftermath of the Nuncio touched Fletcher and Jaffe's opening scuffle, which largely destroyed the lab building where they had conducted their bizarre experiment and ritual to produce the metamaterial, Raoul remained behind in the ruins as a kind of perpetual caretaker slash guardian for somewhere between 18 and 19 years. It would be the arrival of Tesla Bombeck and Tommy Ray, the Nunciate's chosen champions, later on, who would end up coming along and dragging Raoul out of his peaceful and largely solitary stewardship over the remaining metamaterial all those years later. During their scuffle over the remaining Nuncio, Tommy Ray would be touched and altered by it much as his spiritual father, the Jaffe, had been. Raoul would get a small second exposure on his arm, in large part because he used the very last dregs of this material to resurrect a dying, gunshot, and confused Tesla, who suffered these injuries at the hands of Tommy Ray. And obviously, Tesla Bombeck was now also touched by the metamaterial by being laid in the remains of this substance. As one might have gathered from the title of this write-up piece, it is my contention that all four of the male recipients of the Nuncio's blessings ended up proving to not really being up to the task of fully coping with the changes that it rendered in them, though Fletcher, amongst those four, did the best. Yet, in keeping with the eternal dichotomy of good versus evil, or light versus dark, it proved out that Fletcher fared far better with the power than his foes, the Jaffe and Tommy Ray, and he did better than the slightly more neutral and confounded Raoul. Fletcher's chief failing when dealing with the powers and capacities of the Nuncio, to my mind, was a failure to take fullest advantage of that power in opposing the Jaffe. It has been remarked upon by philosophers and scholars like Seneca, Joseph Campbell, Thomas Sowell, and even Alan Watts that those men and women most skeptical or disinterested in the attainment of power are actually those folks who are best suited to have it, because they are the least likely to abuse it. While I empathized with this view, Fletcher's unwillingness to flex that power to his utmost resulted in his having to resort to a form of self-sacrifice to raise the hallucigenia, his spiritual soldiery, to oppose the Jaffe's Tarata in Palamo Grove. As a sideline note, the once scientist also proved quite unpersonable, so unpersonable that Howie Katz, his spiritual offspring and answer to Tommy Ray and Joe Beth, could not be moved to take up Fletcher's work as the protector of quiddity and opposition to the Jaffe. As for Raoul, it might not be fair to compare his response to the Nuncio to Fletcher, Jaffe, or Tommy Ray, given that his starting point was literally as a lesser evolved life form. Still, he couldn't contend with that second splash on his arm, because that second touch also allowed Kassoon to latch onto him and to drag Raoul to his hut inside the loop, swapping bodies with him in Kassoon's efforts to bring the Iad Ouroboros into the Cosm and escape the time loop as their herald, a kind of perverted old Silver Surfer in his own weird way. Randolph Jaffe, the principal antagonist for 70 to 80% of the Great and Secret show, is really only shown once prior to his final minutes before using the art to rip a hole in reality, opening a physical path to quiddity and the island of ephemera, to maybe not be in total control of his Nuncio-born powers. That moment comes when Fletcher confronts him directly at the Palamo Grove Mall, and could be easily explained by being taken off guard by his enemy's sacrificial tactic. Later on, though, the Jaffe is so out of his depth that he literally chews off most of his own hands when he recognizes the depth of how badly he fucked up all of existence. But even at his lowest point as a villain, the Jaffe doesn't come close to his son, Tommy Ray, and how woefully inept he was as a recipient of the Nuncio's blessings, possibly explicable by the fact that Tommy Ray was just an 18-year-old kid. Tommy Ray, who had by then already dubbed himself the Death Boy, this is terrible teenage edgelord claptrap, becomes a sickly-looking, unwilling necromancer of sorts, drawing to himself specters and phantoms of the dead, a kind of walking ghost magnet for hostile spirits. Unlike Fletcher and Jaffe, Tommy Ray displays no ability to govern who or what joins his dust cloud-like legion of the undead spirits. He only directs their malice once or twice consciously, and on at least one occasion he completely loses command of them altogether as they destroy his mother's home, killing her. Even drifting in the dream sea of quiddity at the end of the story, his legion is absorbed into him, altering Tommy Ray into a reflection of them and their undead nature. Tommy Ray ends his piece in the tale as mostly a kind of wasted opportunity. In the long run, though, all four of these nunciates ended up contributing to the one nunciate who didn't screw the pooch, and we'll be taking a look at her, Tesla Bombeck, later on. For now, remember this. Having power does not mean a person is capable of best wielding it. I'm going to take another quick pee break. I'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. Too much coffee. Again, my apologies for that, folks. Back we are. Moving on to the third supplemental piece for talking about Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show. Kissoon, Cosmic Creepazoid Extraordinaire. Bear in mind for the kind of the last portion of this supplemental, I recommend a strong stomach. Just saying. In fantasy genre fiction, there is a long-running trope that has been utilized so many times that it has become sort of an easy thing to joke about, and it goes something like this. Protagonist meets wise sage early on. Sage imbues skills or abilities to the protagonist, offers them snippets of wisdom. The protagonist exits the tutelage either on their own or as a result of the sage's seeming death or disappearance. The sage then shows up in shocking twist later on, turns out to be a villain or working with the villains, and had been initially trying to make the protagonist into their unwitting tool or ally. End trope. We've seen this trope at play in all kinds of mythologies, from the Hesserin Magi of the Seelie court in Celtic mythology and lore, who tried to trick King Owen into cutting off mankind from all magic and miracles, to Senator Palpatine turning Anakin to the dark side. We've even seen it in video games with Seymour in Final Fantasy X, or the guy who trains your character in Fable. Rarely is this sagastic character quite as oblique or ultimately gross as Clive Barker's Cassoon of The Great and Secret Show. Cassoon appears first in the tale as a mysterious but vital figure in Randolph Jaffe's quest for the secrets of the art, the shrouded power that allows its wielder control over the very fabric of reality itself, and to gain access to quiddity, the dream sea. Possessed of an obscure, obtuse manner of speech, Cassoon, who declares himself a member of the Shoal, a deeply secret semi-religious organization, and guardians of quiddity, seems hesitant to aid Randolph Jaffe in his efforts. Given what we know about Randolph Jaffe thus far into the book, readers might be forgiven for assuming that Cassoon is actually one of the good guys. Boy, howdy, is that assumption blown apart by the end of the book. The second person to come into contact with Cassoon is Tesla, shortly after her contact with the Nuncio, as it works to resurrect her. During this meeting, Cassoon answers Tesla's questions about the quiddity, the art, and the whole weirdness that she's been roped into in a very oblique and vague way, trying ultimately to spiritually or magically overwhelm her and get her to surrender her physical body to him as a host for his mind/spirit. He claims that he wishes this exchange in order to protect quiddity from the Jaffe out in the cosm or real world. But Tesla, ever the skeptic, thanks to her years of dealing with frauds and fakes in Hollywood, doesn't entirely buy what he is selling, and good for her. It's a good thing, and we'll soon see what partially might have tipped her off. Firstly, he sports an erection at her and says, "You should be flattered," and soon exposes that he's keeping secrets, trying to manipulate her. Despite never getting any specifics, Tesla learns from a wounded Mary Morales, the only other surviving member of the Shoal, who she sees out in the loop, wandering the wastes and wounded. This secret sect who guards the art and quiddity, well, Morales informs Tesla that Cassoon betrayed and arranged the murder of his brothers and sisters in this order, dumping their bodies in one of the fake houses inside the town, trapped in Cassoon's loop, a strange kind of pocket dimension of existence trapped outside the flow of time, which we, near the end of the story, discover was a pocket of time frozen in a place known as Trinity, New Mexico, back in the 1940s when they were testing the atomic bomb. Cassoon is a prisoner of this loop, Tesla learns, and he can only leave if he does so in someone else's flesh. Hence, his attempts to trick the Jaffe earlier in the book, and Tesla now. Before she can learn much more from Morales about Cassoon's treachery, however, the old sage reaches out into the cosm, reawakening the Licks, the dense snake-like predators from the loop that Tesla inadvertently brought back with her into her world when she escaped Cassoon's second compelled meeting with Morales in tow. One of these monsters ends up attacking Raoul as a distraction, so that others of their kind can end up butchering Morales in Tesla's bedroom. We now know without a doubt that Cassoon is a traitor, a trickster, a liar, a murderer, and a creep. Moreover, we soon discover just how much of a creep he is when we learn what precisely the Licks are. And this is where we're going to have to, once again, caution you. I hope you have a strong stomach. Barker's world building in The Great and Secret Show relies in part on the Lovecraftian style of employing a heavy dose of vagary. This works well for the story, though a few hard and fast rules are laid out. One of those rules for the Shoal, this shadowy sect that Kissoon worms his way into is that they cannot engage in self-pleasure or arousal. Okay, it's a little odd, given how heavy-handed Barker can get with the smutty stuff, but that's no big deal, right? There's other monastic orders, monk-like brotherhoods in fiction and nonfiction that had proscriptions historically against that sort of indulgence. It's no big deal, right? Wrong. So wrong. And we're about to discover why I say that. To avoid breaking the rules about self-arousal, Kissoon uses his powers of compulsion to force bugs to swarm over his flesh and, well, do what needs doing, as it were. And what does he use his magically infused seed to do, folks? Well, he offloads it, literally, onto his own feces. This mix of life energy from his spilled seed and corruption from his bodily waste becomes the licks. These worm snake monstrosities with gnashing teeth are literally the product of bent rules and crap. They are degeneracy incarnate with teeth. It's an amazing bit of perversion and leaves one wondering if it was really necessary for Barker to go this far. I know I shouldn't be so skittish or prudish about it, but this revelation regarding the licks genuinely made me queasy at first. My mind revolted and it went immediately to the recognition that, broken down to its base components, the Morales woman, Raoul, and Tesla were attacked by sentient, overgrown globs of jizz-covered shit. That's horrific. And later on, poor Hotchkiss gets smothered to death by this jizzy poop. Kissoon, ladies and gentlemen, creepazoid extraordinaire. It's grotesque. Yeah. Brutally grotesque. And now I'm going to present to you the last of the supplementals that I wrote up regarding Barker's The Great and Secret Show. Tesla Bombeck. Not ideal, but not terrible. When The Great and Secret Show hit bookshelves back in 1989, the general tone of Western culture was still very much couched in a Reaganomic Americana. Popular films, television shows, comic books, cartoons, novels, and songs on the radio were drenched in a kind of late-stage Cold War America rocks and big men with big guns kick ass. Now let's blow some shit up and wave the stars and stripes, woohoo, cheerleader vibe. Before you grab the pitchforks and torches, understand that I'm a fan of that atmosphere, folks, and I'd like to return to it. So if the postmodernists and the America is awful crowd could just go ahead and take those mob tools, there we go. Are you set? Good. Kiss my ass. The notion of the modern day feminist girl boss had not yet been unleashed on popular culture at the time, as evidenced by much of that pop culture being, enjoyable and, profitable, as opposed to the insufferable and failing that we see nowadays. But that isn't to say that there were no strong, sturdy female figures to respect or admire during that era. I would point you to Ripley from Alien and Aliens, released in 1979 and 1986, or Samus Aran of Metroid on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1986, or Isabel and Susan, Death's daughter and granddaughter in Sir Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. Let us also not overlook Psylocke, Jean Grey, Storm, Jubilee, Batgirl, Huntress, or Wonder Woman in comic books. Let's go ahead and toss in Tuck from Death's Head 2 with those ladies as well, though she was a late addition to the crew back in 1996 and 97, much like Joanna Dark of Rare Interactive's Perfect Dark. Lara Croft, anyone? My point should be clear by now, and if it isn't, you're not actually paying attention. You're seething and waiting for the opening to just call me a sexist or misogynist and have done with it. Go ahead and knock yourselves out. I don't give a fuck. Are you good? Let's continue. Being a sentient human, an American male in the year 2025, middle-aged and Caucasian and cisgendered and straight, oh, the horror of it all! One might not be shocked to learn that I have developed a kind of Pavlov's dog's reaction to the introduction into any genre fiction narrative of a central female character who is instantly promoted into a central role as a protagonist. As Tesla Bombeck was previously just kind of a supplemental character attached to Grillo, a journalist, when she was selected by the Nunciate Fletcher to become his scion, since Howie Katz pretty much rejected the role, I could feel my eyes rolling in their sockets as I sighed. Here we go. Well ahead of the modern audience era of today, a male protagonist is about to be supplanted by a female who, up to this point, had barely been a supporting character, I thought. But, looking back now, having finished the book, that moment Josh deserves to be slapped upside the head and told to exercise some goddamn patience, because that girl boss replacement phenomenon is not what happened in Barker's The Great and Secret Show. This is a lot more Metroid and a lot less Ghostbusters 2016. Now, this is not to say that Tesla Bombeck is the perfect protagonist character. Not by far. She does, in fact, have a couple of girl power moments in both internal and external dialogue that butt right up against that men bad, women best horse shit that makes most guys like myself go limp in the pants and want to walk away. The second time that this is noticeable is after she's been touched by the nuncio, when she rather uncharitably thinks, of course these men would fuck it up, this blessing of power, referring to the nuncio as it had enhanced Fletcher, Jaffe, and Tommy Ray. But this self-assured cockiness on her part is both part of her previously established personality, and it's proven to be a bit of a cope, as she's not entirely sure herself that she can fix the circumstances of the story's events, and she admits to this uncertainty. She doesn't instantly gain knowledge or ability on her own. She doesn't assume that she can do what nobody else can just because. She relies on the support and aid of other characters, including one who is half the reason that things get as fucked up as they even do in the form of the Jaffe later on. Tesla is every bit the dreamer and creative, brought into the story to begin with by Grillo, a muckraker reporter who turns to her for her wealth of Hollywood insider info when he's investigating the story of the death of Buddy Vance, a longtime comedic figure in the story's setting. She's a would-be screenwriter, someone well-versed in fiction, mythology, and scuttlebutt and rumors, the stuff of dreams. She's a veteran of storytelling and movie-making business bullshittery. That's why she doesn't quickly trust Kassoon. She has dealt with these kinds of con men before. And make no mistake, Tesla does screw the pooch and commit unforced errors as the hero. For starters, she didn't miraculously dodge or avoid Tommy Ray's attack at the mission when she went to secure the remains of the nuncio. She got shot. She didn't stop him from touching the nuncio. Secondly, despite saving Morales from Kassoon's loop and starting to learn more about the Shoal, Kassoon, and the art from that woman, Tesla got distracted by a lone Lix attacking Raoul. allowing the other 4 or 5 of these horrific creatures to kill Morales in her bedroom. She barely saved Grillo from the schism when Jaffe first tore open a hole in reality. Tesla sent Hotchkiss ultimately to his demise in the pet store. She relied on mangled Randolph Jaffe to overpower and kill the Kassoon-possessed Raoul in the loop, ultimately because he was beating the absolute shit out of her. Tesla Bombeck was not an all-powerful girl boss. I've seen a few reviewers take exception to Fletcher selecting her as his proxy scion prior to his self-sacrifice at the Palamo Grove Mall, but I would argue that she was actually the best choice. Why? Because like Fletcher, she's a dreamer. Like Fletcher, she's skeptical, dealing with Hollywood types. For him, he was a scientist who they have to employ skepticism. And they were especially skeptical of power. Fletcher's power was of the hallucigenia, creatures that are embodiments of dreams. Who better to be his proxy than a screenwriter, a dreamer? Now, to be fair, there may have been a dollop of self-insert or masturbatory character design by Clive Barker there. That's granted. But from a mythologist's point of view, this is actually perfectly pat. I believe Joseph Campbell would be proud of Barker's deployment of archetypes with Tesla Bombeck. So, with her flaws and foibles, her missteps, and her abrupt shift from secondary to primary cast character, one might think that I didn't like her, and one would be wrong. It is because she is flawed but willing to try. Character traits shift, but they shift in keeping with the story's admittedly janky pace, and because she exhibits character growth that I personally found to be organic and well-timed, that I found Tesla Bombeck to be an excellent character creation by Clive Barker. She's not ideal. She's flawed, and she fucks up, sure, but she's far from terrible, and is actually a great leading lady for the Great and Secret Show. Whew! So, that's all I've got written down regarding this particular novel. I did not realize that it would lead me to droning on for a little over an hour, although we have to clip out a few minutes of that runtime given a couple of pee breaks. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The Storyteller's Corner review of Clive Barker's 1989 The Great and Secret Show. Quite frankly, a fabulous read. And I only own a copy of it on my Kindle. I have a digital copy. However, much like some of my all-time favorite novels, I am going to be going and securing myself a physical copy, because when it comes to those books that I have found the most deeply impactful, to own a physical copy of the work. I will always recommend have a physical copy of your favorite books, the ones that mean the most to you. Get a physical copy, because digital, while it's convenient, is not 100% reliable. And when it comes to mythology, I would also always recommend grab yourself physical copies. This is from Flame Tree Publishing. Got the entire first series set of these folklore and mythology collections for my research purposes when I'm doing cross-referencing and trying to see that I'm on the right path intellectually or academically when doing mythological comparisons. I like to make sure I have that kind of stuff on hand. So I'm going to be wrapping up here shortly, despite the fact that now I've got 4 live viewers on Rumble. It's okay. If you want to know what you missed, just go back and watch the stream from the beginning, and you'll know. I do apologize for those of you who have come in late. And provided this worked out appropriately, if you came here from YouTube, if you were annoyed that the stream got cut off or suddenly just showed the Rumble image overlay, I intend to do this sort of thing going forward with my individual streams. I'm going to partition them off, where the first portion will be for both YouTube and Rumble, but any extras, any deeply vested material will be exclusively for the folks who come over to the Rumble portion and watch and listen from there. This is the current plan. It's always subject to change. Things might fluctuate. I don't know. I am a rank amateur at this shit when it comes to streaming. What am I any good at? Reading, analyzing, and telling stories. That's my bag. Anyhow, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Ladies and gentlemen, from my home in southern Minnesota here in the frozen tundra, I would like to extend my great thanks to you for deciding to take the opportunity to give a watch and or listen to this extensive review and ramble regarding Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show. I do hope that you found it a bit of edification. And for those of you who have not yet read the book, and might be inclined to now that you have heard my review and a handful of supplemental bits and pieces, I really do hope that inspires you to go out and get a copy and give it a read. There may be something that you catch that I missed. That's very possible. I'm just one guy. And this sort of mythological story deserves to have many more eyes upon it and many more minds mulling it over. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves. And as always, keep reading. Okay.